Although it took the series in a wildly different direction, Resident Evil 4 is widely regarded as the peak of the franchise, one of the best games ever made, and for me, it's tied as my second favourite game of all time. However, unlike Halo 2 and Metal Gear Solid 2, I actually didn't play Resident Evil 4 at all growing up. I think the first time I played it was like 2009 or something, so I really don't think that nostalgia has any part to play in that. There's something strangely comfy about this game. It's a survival horror game set in the gloomy forests and cult-infested castles of rural Spain, so it has no right being comfy whatsoever. But there's just something about the gothic atmosphere that Capcom created that feels weirdly comforting, which is one of the many reasons why I always return to it. Ever since the iconic "We Do It" moment for Resident Evil 2 Remake, the clock has been ticking for Resident Evil 4 to eventually get the same treatment. And at long last, that moment has finally arrived. On March 24th, 2023, we'll finally be returning to the gloomy woods of Spain for another parasite-fueled journey. Except this time, it's gonna be rather different. RE4 isn't getting the Halo 2 Anniversary style one-to-one remaster treatment, rather, in line with Resident Evil 2 and 3, it's getting a complete remake, although they seem to in fact be taking it a step further this time, so much so that Capcom aren't even calling it Resident Evil 4 Remake like they did with RE2 and RE3, rather just Resident Evil 4. In their own words, Resident Evil 4 preserves the essence of the original game while introducing modernised gameplay, a reimagined storyline, and vividly detailed graphics to make this the latest survival horror game where life and death, terror and catharsis intersect. So, where the goal of a remaster is to simply give an old game a modernised look and sound whilst retaining everything else, the goal of a remake is to reinvent the original experience, to take another stab at its ideas, philosophies and design, while still retaining its original essence and soul. But with the original RE4 already considered close to perfection by many, why try and remake that experience if an already close to perfect version of it already exists? Surely because of that, the best way to go would be a remaster, right? Well, were it almost any other beloved game of mine, I'd almost entirely agree, but I genuinely think that with RE4, Capcom have gone in the right direction going with a remake. You see, with a remaster, the whole point is to modernise a game's original aesthetic while still keeping it very much intact, but I think so much of RE4's aesthetic is entrenched in the graphical limitations of the early to mid-2000s and the unique aesthetics that were born from those limitations. Its gloomy atmosphere, with low-res textures giving off a faux dirty look to all the environments, from the village to the castle and even the laboratories in the island, I think are almost entirely irreplicable. But it goes beyond just mere aesthetic. The way the rooms and encounters were designed were very different to how games nowadays design them. Instead of trying to be as realistic and believable as possible in their layout and functionality, they allow themselves to be rather video gamey. They lean very much into the suspension of disbelief for the sake of fun and to feed the adventure, and in doing so, all feel incredibly memorable and unique. And then there's the soundtrack, which, granted, I do think is probably the most replicable element of the overall game, but still, it has this almost hazy and kind of trance-like quality to it in certain parts that really serves to invoke that almost indescribable early 2000s feel. Now, not to go on a weird, overly personal tangent or anything, but growing up, I used to go to this theme park in the UK several times a year called Alton Towers, and the coolest thing about this place is that it's a theme park built in the grounds of a really aesthetic neo-Gothic stately home that always looks so imposing at night. When I was younger, I always used to get this really creepy vibe from the towers and the style of architecture, which was kind of the point. And as weird as it sounds, I think what's happened here is Resident Evil 4's emphasis on Gothic architecture and the gloomy atmosphere that it creates have kind of sparked and blended with my memories of that place growing up, And also a lot of the kind of gothic themes in media at that time in the early 2000s. You had things like My Chemical Romance in music and loads of edgy vampire movies coming out as well. It was quite a big era for gothic media. And I think what's happened is all those things have kind of blended together into one kind of feeling or emotion. And whenever I play Resident Evil 4, because of the gothic undertones of it and the gloomy atmosphere of the woods, it kind of sparks that feeling slash emotion. It's like a kind of nostalgia for a period that I never experienced because, like I said, I never played RE4 growing up. But the atmosphere of RE4 really reminds me of the gothic towers and the gloomy woods that surround it, and like I said as well, a lot of the gothic things in the media at the time. That was such a weird tangent. I just had to get that off my chest because it's such a weird feeling that I've felt pretty much from the get-go since first playing RE4. And I've spent so long trying to put it into words, and I think that is the closest I will ever get, so whether you enjoyed that little tangent or not, let me know your thoughts down below in the comment. You know what, I think we need a break after that.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
No, Leon, you literally just watched them walk into the church. Dude, you need to take a page out of Hunnigan's book and start wearing glasses, man. Seriously, all that blue light exposure, clearly not doing your eyes any favours. And you know what? Thankfully for you, today's video is sponsored by GMG Performance, so you can finally get yourself a pair before your grand return to Spain next year. Now, just to snap back to the real world for a second, I, like almost all of humanity, spend about 95% of my waking hours staring at screens. I have 3 in front of me right now, which means that as a consequence, I'm exposed to large quantities of blue light, which is where these bad boys come in. These bad boys act as a shield against blue light, helping to reduce eye strain, improve concentration, and maintain long-term vision quality. Now, the biggest difference that I've noticed from wearing these bad boys is my sleep quality. I'm typically staring at a screen right up until I go to sleep, but because I wear these bad boys, the GMG optimizers, the blue light doesn't negatively impact my sleep at all, which is a problem that I've suffered from for God knows how many years. GMG did also send me the performance model of glasses, which are really nice, but honestly, these bad boys are my favourites. So, if like Leon, you need to protect your eyes from harmful blue light, then boy, I've got a great deal for you.
Got something that might interest you.
Click that link at the top of the description and you get a 40% discount off a pair of GMG glasses. However, be quick because that offer is only valid for 48 hours after this video goes live. You could say it'll be gone in a flash. Anyways, the bottom line is that being a remake over a remaster gives the designers so much more room to breathe. Not being confined so tightly by the original experience allows for more experimentation with the original ideas that created it. It can get away with not retaining that original aesthetic one-to-one because it's, at its core, a very different version of the RE4 experience. Anyway, moving away from talking like a stoned hippie for a minute, I was initially going to talk about sections of the original RE4 that I'd like to see brought into the modern day in a one-to-one fashion. But the list started to get really long, so I thought it might actually be more fun and also much more concise to talk about certain things that I think should be reworked and or removed and replaced with something else from the original RE4, because as much as I absolutely adore that game, it was by no means perfect. However, before we do, I've just got to note that one of my greatest fears with this game is it succumbing to the same downfalls as the RE3 remake, and having sections removed and torn out with nothing new added to replace them, which not only removes iconic sections of the game, but also severely damages the pacing. Resident Evil 3 Remake was over way too fast because the clock tower and graveyard sections were cut, likely because the game was a complete rush job, quite frankly. Now, thankfully, it's actually Capcom Dev 1, who are the studio that made RE2 Remake, that are working on RE4 Remake, not M2 who did RE3R. And it's clear that Resident Evil 4 Remake is being taken far more seriously than 3 was, so I'm not too worried about this happening, but it's just something that I'm keeping in my mind. The reason I fear this so much with Resident Evil 4 is because its pacing, for the most part, I think, is genuinely perfect from start to finish. If you were to start hacking it apart, removing certain bits and pieces from every act, then you'd really damage that pacing, and the game wouldn't flow anywhere near as well as it originally did. I did say for the most part though, because Act 4 and Act 5 are where I think the pacing really begins to falter, and it's where I'd like to see the most alterations made. Remember, this game is not a remaster. Capcom are calling it a reawakening, so it will be different in some areas. The section that I'm hoping to see change the most is the island, so pretty much all of Act 5. Besides the Regenerator encounters and the U3 fight, I would honestly be okay with the entirety of the island being reworked. It's where the game noticeably starts to kind of run away with itself a little bit, moving away from action survival horror to just pure action. Don't get me wrong, its encounter design is still pretty fun for the most part, but I think that's primarily thanks to how satisfying RE4's gameplay loop is, unlike the rest of the game, where it's this equal balance between the fantastic gameplay and the fantastic enemy design. The increased volume of range-based enemies interfered with the gameplay pacing because, despite them not actually being zombies, there was a clear effort made to make most of the Ganados and cultists behave rather similarly to the zombies that RE fans were used to, just with that little bit of extra flair. But when so many more of the enemies just stand still and shoot you over actually moving towards you, that zombie horde-like feeling is broken. That said, I don't want the island to just be a repeat of the village or the castle. I think it absolutely has merit as the action-fueled crescendo of the overall adventure, and I wouldn't want that vibe to be taken away. I think, if anything, I just want maybe some more puzzles added to the island, just to kind of ground it a bit more in that classic Resident Evil feel. But how heavy the action is in the outdoor sections of the island contrasts insanely well with how horror-focused some of the interior sections are. That first time that you go through the door into the labs, the theming goes from bombastic action to just dead fucking silent. No music, no enemies in sight, nothing. Just the sound of Leon's footsteps. It's like thematic whiplash, and it feeds into the Regenerator sections so damn perfectly. And hell, it even manages to create a few horror-esque moments with the soldiers as well. This thematic contrast created by the action-heavy sections is something that I absolutely want to remain. That said though, I would definitely be down for them just gutting most of the island encounters and taking another stab at them, because I think they could be done far better than they actually were. And then there are some of the more over-the-top sections that I'd be fine with them toning down a little bit as well. Don't get me wrong, a big part of RE4's identity was its goofiness at times, and I don't want Capcom to just turn the entire thing into a pure horror experience, because that's not what RE4 is, right? But gimmicky ass sections like the bulldozer, and as Sphere Hunter put it very well, the Salazar Gundam can be reworked and or totally removed for all I care, to be honest with you. The bulldozer section is, for all intents and purposes, just a 10-minute long on-rails ammo depleter, and the Salazar Gundam adds nothing in terms of gameplay, story, or atmosphere. It just looks ridiculous, even within the confines of RE4. To be honest, I'd even be fine with the final Saladin boss fight being changed as well. I don't really think that fight does anything particularly unique or interesting that I'd be sorry to see go. As long as they keep this horrific shot, mind you. Now, with Resident Evil 4 being a reawakening, I think we can expect far more changes to the original experience than just the reworking of certain areas. With how big of a deal this game is, along with some of the notorious content that was cut during its original development, I don't think it's too far-fetched to assume that we'll get some additions to this adventure as well. But I'm in a tough spot when it comes to additions, because on the one hand, I'd love to see some things from the fabled Resident Evil 3.5 build added to the game and mixed in with the original formula, but at the same time, I think RE4's pacing is near perfect, and I wouldn't want any additions to certain sections to cause them to drag on for longer than they need to. As much as I would absolutely love to have the village sections expanded, in particular the nighttime sections, I do think that Acts 1 through 3 are literally perfect in terms of pacing and length. Act 4 is decent, but I think if any section were to get expanded, it'd be Act 5, the island, which would coincide pretty perfectly with my hopes that the island does get a rework. It always seems like it's over a bit too fast, and like the worst areas have too much presence, and the best areas have too little presence. I'd love to explore the regenerator lab some more, and also that prison that you only briefly go through in, I think, chapter 4. That section in that one prison room with the regenerators was another one of those thematic whiplash sections. As small as it was, it had a fantastic horror atmosphere, and I think expanding that section of the island in place of the way too long action sequence right before it would be fantastic. Of course though, right now this is all just pure speculation, hopes and dreams, but based on what we've seen so far, it does appear as though Ashley's going to be getting more presence early on in the story. Whether that's a new playable section or a cutscene, we don't know. It could just be trailer smoke and mirrors for all we know, but with Capcom's tease of a reimagined storyline, I can see it happening. And on that note, let's talk story. Something that I already love about this remake is that there feels like there's been a conscious effort to make it feel like more of a direct continuation of Leon's story from the whole Raccoon City saga, and to have its overall story also feel more connected to the games set in Raccoon City. Obviously, OG RE4 definitely had elements of this, but I think broadly speaking, that game felt like it was trying to be exclusive and stand very much on its own 2 feet, both in terms of its overall story and also its characterization of Leon. As somebody who was too young to experience the original trilogy in chronological order as it released back in the day, finally getting to experience this continuity in both the overarching story and also Leon's characterization with the modern remakes has me so excited. I can't wait to see where Dev 1 take this excellent version of Leon's character that they built up so well in the RE2 remake in RE4. Especially when Ada starts to show up.
If I could just forget what happened that night. The pain. Even for a second. This time, it can be different. It has to.
But the alterations to the story are likely going to go far deeper than just Leon's characterization. It being referred to as a reimagined story honestly has me pretty damn curious and surprisingly not that worried. Were this any other beloved game of mine, I'd be frankly terrified about its story getting completely reimagined. But with RE4, I'm actually okay with its story getting redone. I don't think that RE4's story was ever one of its defining traits, so really, as long as they keep the main plot points and the main themes of the story intact and don't pull a Resident Evil 3 remake and just go cutting entire sections of it, I'm more so just intrigued to see how they do it this time. The small glimpses that we got of it from the trailer do look pretty promising as well. It looks like they're going to be fleshing out some areas of the story that were left kind of untouched in the original. This scene showing Leon talking to President Graham, for example. I'd love to see more stuff like this that adds more context to the mission to save Baby Eagle, which, by the way, is a really cool codename for Ashley. This goes for other elements of the story as well, like Krauser, for example. Despite RE4 being Krauser's first appearance, he and Leon have quite the backstory that the original RE4 only ever briefly mentions, so I'd love to get some story additions and maybe some flashbacks or something that touch on their backstory more to create an even better setup for their fight. Krauser's defection to Wesker never really had much of an impact because we knew nothing about the guy, but if he got some more fleshing out beforehand, well, that'd change the entire stakes for his boss fight for sure. I'd love to see more of Luis as well. I loved his character in the original, but his appearances were sweet and very, very brief, and he had a weird tendency to just randomly vanish after a short interaction.
I forgot something. You guys go on ahead.
So I'd love to get more appearances from him that touch more on his rather shady past and motivations. And talking about shady pasts, I'd love to get a more fleshed out intro cutscene that spends a bit longer going over the fall of Umbrella post RE3. It's kind of just blurted out by Leon in the intro that Umbrella fell after Raccoon City, and then barely touched on again, and you don't even see any of it happening. So I'd love to get a sort of RE3 remake Nemesis creation style intro cutscene that gives us a brief look at the corporation's downfall after Raccoon City was nuked. For all that game's flaws, the intro cutscene to RE3 Remake was fantastic, and something like that about Umbrella would be a great start to RE4. I think there are honestly a lot of really interesting things they could do with RE4's story to kind of spice it up a little bit, considering it wasn't one of the original game's strongest features. However, they've got to ensure that they keep that kind of part horror and part witty soul intact. That strange combination is the soul of Resident Evil 4 and its characters.
Most Illuminados. That's a mouthful. Anyway, I had an unexpected run-in with the big cheese of this village.
From some of the silly shit that Leon comes out with,
No thanks, bro.
to the big cheese and Ramon fucking Salazar. I think one of the most important parts of making sure this monumental remake succeeds is ensuring that that sense of adventure remains. All Resident Evil games have it, but I think because of how differently RE4 handles its sandbox and progression, and the amount of player choice baked into both, it feels even more present and personal here. Finding treasures and having them interact with the economy makes this game feel like a post-apocalyptic Indiana Jones at times.
I'll buy it at a high price.
Having weapons and attachments buyable from this iconic fellow right here, who by the way I am so excited to see in modern graphics, allowed you to go through the game taking on each encounter in a totally different way to your friends. There was so much personal preference baked into it. For example, I always liked maxing out the TMP to shred through regular enemies, and then also maxing out the Killer 7 to destroy bosses, whereas somebody else might go for the Red 9 and the Sniper, or the Riot Shotgun and the Mine Thrower, or they might just be a jack of all trades and master of none and part level up everything. It always felt like you were forging your own unique build path to take on the Los Illuminados in your own way, which collaborated perfectly with the heroic, yet rather cliche, let's be honest, save the president's daughter story trope to create an almost Indiana Jones style adventure. All the facets of RE4 come together to create a truly magical experience. This game is fun, gothic survival horror at its absolute peak. I just hope they're able to retain that magic whilst also giving us a fresh look at one of the best video games ever made. Capcom Dev 1, I have faith in you. And so, those are my thoughts on where Capcom are taking a remake of one of my favourite video games ever created. A game that I love so much, it's literally created an emotion that I can't even put into words. Resident Evil 4 Remastered is without a doubt my #1 most anticipated game right now, and it will be until it releases. So you better believe that I'm going to be doing a follow-up video to this once it releases next March. Trust me, my timer is already ticking for the release. I cannot wait. So if you don't want to miss that video, hit that big old red sub button. Done? Sweet. Okay. With that said, let's round out yet another branch out video. I want to give a massive thank you to Sam S for becoming a new Primordial over on Patreon. Thank you very much, sir. And of course to everyone else who continues to support me over there as well. Thank you all once again for watching yet another branch out video. I really appreciate it. Believe it or not, my next video is actually going to be a Halo one. Crazy, right? So yeah, look out for that bad boy, and I'll catch you all in the next one.